Some dogs don't bark, they don't wag their tails, and they no longer hope because the world has taught them that love is something that can be taken away at any moment. Rusty was one of those dogs, silent behind rusted bars for 5 long years, unseen, unwanted, and forgotten. Until one day, a grieving couple stopped and looked into eyes that had once given up. This isn't a story about a dog being rescued. It's about a soul finding its way home, not with a leap, not with a bark, but with one quiet step forward, into the light. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story, I kindly ask you to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story that might just change how you see the world. Now, let's go back to that quiet afternoon where everything changed for Rusty. For 5 long years, Rusty had lived behind the rusted bars of kennel number 12. Time blurred inside that space. Seasons changed beyond the walls, but inside, everything stayed the same. Cold concrete, the scent of bleach, and the endless echo of barking. His world had shrunk to the length of a cage and the silence of being forgotten. Rusty hadn't always been this way. He was once a proud shepherd, raised by a military man who loved structure, discipline, and quiet loyalty. There had been a backyard, a daily routine, and the warmth of a steady hand on his back. But that life had ended abruptly in a twisted wreck of metal and blood along a rural highway. Rusty had survived. His person hadn't. What came after was chaos. Animal control vans, a temporary foster home, then adoption by a stranger who seemed kind at first. But kindness turned cruel. Rusty had flinched at raised voices, frozen at sudden movements. And when fear drove him to bite, they labeled him dangerous. He was returned within a week. That was the day he stopped wagging his tail. Over time, the shelter became his prison. He watched dozens of dogs come and go, young, old, wounded, loud, shy. They left. He stayed. The hopeful spark in his eyes dimmed each time a family passed him by. The workers fed him, cleaned after him, sometimes scratched his ear. But no one really saw him. He learned not to hope. Hope made the days longer. Hope made the silence louder. Rusty rarely moved now when people walked by. He'd lie still, pressed against the far wall, as if shrinking might make him invisible. And in a way it had. People wanted puppies, not a shepherd with old scars and tired eyes. But behind that quiet, a heart still beat. Not as fast as it once had, not as openly. But it was there, waiting, not for anyone in particular, not anymore. Just waiting for something to break the pattern. And somewhere deep inside, beyond the scars, Rusty still remembered what it had once felt like to be someone's dog. It was the kind of autumn afternoon that felt like the world holding its breath. Leaves rustled in the wind, their gold and crimson edges whispering stories of change. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the worn gravel drive that led to the shelter. A weathered building nestled behind rows of chain-link kennels and forgotten hopes. Inside, nothing had changed for Rusty. He lay curled in the far corner of his enclosure, one ear twitching at the sound of approaching footsteps. He didn't look up. People came and went. Some paused, some pointed. None stayed. He no longer rose when they passed. There was no use pretending. But this time the footsteps were slower. Henry and Louise had not come looking for a puppy. They hadn't really come looking for a dog at all. Not yet. The idea had formed quietly, like fog rolling in around the edges of grief. Their son, Michael, had been gone nearly 3 years. A roadside bomb in a place too far from home. Since then, the house had felt too quiet, the evenings too long. They didn't talk much about the emptiness anymore. but it lived with them in the worn chair he used to sit in the untouched room at the end of the hallway. Louise had been the one to say it first. "Maybe it's time," she whispered one morning over coffee, her eyes fixed on a spot beyond the window. "Not to forget, just to fill the space with something good." So they came, not to replace, but to offer what was left in their hearts. The shelter was louder than Louise had imagined. Dogs barked from all directions, high-pitched yelps, deep-throated howls, the frantic energy of dozens of animals aching for attention. She winced at the noise. Henry walked beside her, quiet, his hands in his coat pockets. He moved like a man carrying something too heavy to set down. A volunteer approached. "Looking for anything in particular?" she asked, smiling politely. "No," Louise replied gently. "Just looking." They walked the rows slowly. Puppies bounced and pawed at the fencing, tails wagging, eyes wide with hope. Some barked for attention, others whimpered softly, and then there was silence. At the far end of the row, Kennel 12 sat quiet. Louise stopped. Rusty didn't move, not at first. He'd heard them approaching, felt the shift in energy when they neared. But experience had taught him better than to expect anything. Still, something in the air felt different, calmer, heavier somehow. He lifted his head just enough to see. Their eyes met. Louise took a step closer, ignoring the faint warning from the volunteer. "That one's been here a long time. Returned once. Doesn't trust easily. We don't show him much anymore." Henry didn't speak, but his gaze never left Rusty. Something about the dog's eyes, the way they watched, not with hope, but with quiet resignation, hit him in a place words couldn't reach. Louise read the history on the plaque by the kennel. Age, 8, breed, German Shepherd. Notes, previously adopted, returned, nervous, may snap under stress. She knelt slowly, resting her hand on the fence. Rusty didn't move. He didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply stared. There was no wagging tail, no softening eyes, but there was stillness. And in that stillness, Louise felt something stir, like finding a song in a language you didn't know you remembered. "I want to meet him," she said. The volunteer hesitated. "Are you sure? He's complicated." "So are we," Henry replied quietly. The introduction happened in the enclosed run behind the shelter. Rusty stood at the far end, stiff, uncertain. Louise and Henry sat on a bench, saying nothing, offering no commands, making no sudden moves. They simply waited. Minutes passed. Then, finally, Rusty took a step forward, one paw, then the other. Not toward them exactly, but not away either. A slow, cautious circle, his eyes never leaving theirs. Henry sat still as stone. Louise let her hands rest in her lap. No tricks, no treats, no expectations, only space. Eventually, Rusty lay down again, a few feet away, his back turned slightly, but his ears tuned in. That was all, but it was enough. Later, inside the shelter office, papers were signed, forms filled, warnings repeated. "He's not a dog you can rush," the volunteer said, her tone gentle but firm. "We're not in a rush," Louise replied. As Henry clipped the leash onto Rusty's collar for the ride home, the old shepherd stood still, not resisting, but not leaning in either. He followed, not because he trusted them, but because they hadn't asked him to. And as the three of them stepped into the fading light of that autumn day, none of them knew for certain what came next. But sometimes, the first step toward healing isn't love, it's being seen. The door of the shelter closed behind them with a quiet thud. Outside, the world looked washed in amber light, late afternoon sun spilling across the gravel parking lot. long shadows cast by old trees that had watched generations come and go. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from some distant chimney. Rusty stood frozen. The leash, now clipped to his collar, hung loose between him and Henry. He didn't pull against it. He didn't move forward either. His paws stayed planted where they were, his body stiff with indecision. Henry waited. They didn't speak. Louise stood by the car, rear door open, a soft blanket spread across the seat. She had laid it out earlier, thinking it might help. The scent of home, or at least of something not metal or bleach. It smelled like lavender and clean fabric softener, like a place meant for resting. Rusty took one cautious step forward. The crunch of gravel beneath his paw seemed louder than it should have been. Another step, then another. But when he reached the car, something in him shifted. A memory surfaced, sharp, immediate, unforgiving. The last time he had been in a car, it had not led to safety. It had been a promise, broken in silence. A ride filled with nervous energy and false kindness, ending in a stranger's cold backyard. Fear had lived there, and pain. The second ride, the one that took him back to the shelter, had sealed the story. Cars meant betrayal. His body trembled. The fur along his spine lifted slightly. His breath quickened, tail tucked low. Louise took a slow step back, sensing the change in his posture. Her hand hovered for a moment near the leash, then fell away. Henry didn't say anything. He moved to the other side of the car, opened the front door, and sat down in the driver's seat. No eye contact, no pressure, just presence. Minutes passed. Rusty stood still, his legs locked, eyes fixed on the open car door, like it might come alive and swallow him whole. But then the wind shifted. A bird called out from the tree line. A dry leaf skipped across the ground and landed gently near his paw. Something softened. With a breath so quiet only Louise noticed, Rusty lifted his front paw and stepped into the car. Just one paw, then the other. Slowly, awkwardly, he hoisted his body onto the seat, turned once, and lay down. Not curled, but ready to bolt if needed. Louise closed the door with deliberate care. The ride began. The hum of tires on asphalt filled the silence. The car moved gently through the back roads, winding past faded barns, yellowing cornfields, and clusters of trees that lined the horizon like sentinels. Rusty lay in the back seat, eyes wide open, muscles tense. Louise turned in her seat once, glanced back at him, then looked away. She didn't reach for him, didn't speak. Henry kept both hands on the wheel, eyes forward. Every so often he'd glance at the rearview mirror, just to make sure the dog hadn't disappeared into a dream. Half an hour passed like that. Then came the turnoff. The trees grew denser. The road narrowed. The sky dimmed slightly as shadows from the forest took over. Rusty stirred. This was too familiar. Trees like these had lined the path to that last place. The backyard with the broken fence, the shouting man, the lonely nights tied to a stake in frozen ground. His breathing quickened. He sat up, his head lowered. A low, almost inaudible whine escaped his throat. Louise heard it. She didn't cry out or turn dramatically. She simply rested her hand on her lap, palm open, facing up. An invitation, not a demand. Henry noticed too. He slowed the car a little, taking the next curve with extra care. Rusty didn't reach out. He didn't move closer, but he didn't panic either. The tension in his shoulders remained, but something else had begun to grow behind his tired eyes. A flicker. Not trust. Not yet. But curiosity, maybe. When they pulled into the long gravel drive that led to the cottage, the car rolled to a stop beneath a canopy of old oaks. The sun was nearly gone now, light spilling low across the roof in gold streaks. Louise opened her door and stepped out first. Then Henry. The car door on Rusty's side remained closed for a moment longer. Then Henry opened it. He didn't say a word, just waited. Rusty blinked. The air outside smelled different here, cleaner, softer. There was no sharp tang of metal, no barking, no bleach. Just damp earth, leaves, and the faintest scent of something baking from a nearby kitchen window. He stepped out. His paws touched the ground. It wasn't a cage floor. It wasn't the place he had run from. It wasn't even home. Not yet. But it was something new. And for a dog who had been broken by too many promises, that was already more than he expected. The first nights were quiet. Too quiet. Rusty moved through the house like a shadow, hugging the edges of walls, never venturing far from the door. He ate when no one was looking, drank only when the room was still. Every sudden noise made him flinch. When Louise folded laundry and dropped a shirt too quickly, he bolted. When Henry coughed too loudly, Rusty froze in place, eyes wide, as if waiting for punishment. Henry and Louise didn't press. They watched him with the same patience one might offer a wounded deer. Hands always visible, voices always low. They didn't touch him unless he came close, which he rarely did. Instead, they let time move gently around him, as if hoping that softness, offered again and again, might wear down the armor he wore like old skin. Outside the house, fall gave way to early winter. The days shortened, the mornings grew colder, and with the cold came stillness. Frost on window panes, breath visible in the early light, birds migrating overhead in tight formations. It was during one of these mornings, quiet and grey, that the first fracture appeared. It started with a sound, distant but sharp, the crack of a rifle. Somewhere in the woods, a hunter fired a shot, the echo rolling through the trees like a forgotten memory. Henry, out on the porch sipping his coffee, barely flinched. But inside the house, Rusty reacted as if the world had exploded. His body jolted. He let out a sharp, panicked bark and sprinted for the back door, claws scraping wood. Before Henry could react, Rusty threw his weight against the screen door, and it gave way with a metallic rattle. He was gone. The field behind the house was wide, open, edged by trees that reached for the sky like bony fingers. Beyond that, miles of forest, cold, dense, and unforgiving. By the time Henry reached the edge of the yard, Rusty had vanished into the trees. Louise wept when she heard. "I should have known," she whispered. "He wasn't ready. We weren't enough." But Henry didn't answer. He was already packing a bag, boots, flashlight, a coat, a thermos. He didn't speak as he loaded the truck. He just moved with the grim determination of someone who knew what it meant to lose something they couldn't replace. He searched the woods for 2 days. He followed paw prints through frozen leaves. He asked neighbors. He left food in clearings. At night, he lit a fire in the field and sat by it until the embers faded, hoping Rusty might see the glow and come back. But nothing. Then, on the 3rd day, just as the light began to fade and snow started to fall in soft, aimless spirals, Henry spotted movement near the edge of a thicket. He followed, slow and steady, boots crunching over ice. And there he was. Rusty stood beneath a fallen pine, its trunk split and leaning against another tree like a broken arm. At first, Henry thought he was alone, but then he saw the small shape beside him. A puppy, thin, muddy, shivering beneath Rusty's chest. Rusty wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was protecting. Henry didn't move. He crouched slowly, one knee to the ground, arms resting on his thighs. Rusty looked at him. There was no panic in his eyes now, just exhaustion. And something else, recognition. He had chosen not to keep running. He had stayed, not for himself, but for something smaller, more fragile. Henry waited. Minutes passed before Rusty stepped forward, nudging the puppy ahead of him. The pup stumbled slightly but followed, trusting the bigger dog's lead. Rusty walked cautiously, eyes on Henry, but no longer afraid. When they reached him, Henry didn't say a word. He simply opened his coat and waited. Rusty didn't resist as the puppy was scooped into one arm, and a moment later, Rusty leaned against his side. Just slightly, just enough. They walked back through the woods together. The snow thickened, the sky darkened, but between them something had shifted. At home, Louise ran out to meet them, tears spilling freely. She knelt beside Rusty, who stood still as her hand reached out, trembling, to touch the side of his face. For the first time, he didn't pull away. That night the fireplace burned warm and steady. The puppy slept curled in a blanket near the hearth. Rusty lay nearby, his body finally still, not from fear, but from something like peace. He had run, yes, but he had also come back, and in coming back he had made his first choice. Not out of fear, not to escape, but to protect, to belong. The snow didn't last. By morning it had melted into the earth, leaving patches of damp grass and darkened soil beneath a pale winter sky. The house was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fireplace and the occasional thump of the puppy's tail, twitching in his sleep. Louise sat by the window, cradling a mug between her palms, her eyes following the long path beyond the porch. She hadn't slept much. Neither had Henry. Rusty lay near the front door, not guarding it, just resting. His body no longer trembled at creaking floorboards or distant thunder. He didn't flinch when Henry passed by or when Louise reached gently to refill his bowl. Something in him had changed, not all at once, but enough, and Henry noticed. That morning he opened the back door and stepped out into the pale light, boots crunching softly against frostbitten grass. The air was sharp, but not bitter. Overhead, a flock of birds passed, their calls distant, fleeting. Rusty stood at the threshold, tail low but not tucked, head lifted slightly. Henry didn't call him. He simply walked, crossing the yard toward the open field behind the house, a stretch of land that sloped gently into a line of trees, its tall grass now flattened by winter's breath. He stopped near the edge of it, where the ground was dry enough to stand without sinking. Then he waited. It took Rusty a few moments. His paws pressed tentatively against the cold porch wood. He sniffed the air. His eyes followed Henry's silhouette, tall, quiet, still. The leash was not in sight. There were no commands, no pressure, just the open field and trust. Rusty stepped forward, first the stairs, then the frost-kissed grass, his nails tapping faintly as he moved. The puppy, now affectionately called Scout, peeked out from behind the curtain, tail thumping wildly. But this wasn't his moment, not yet. Rusty reached the edge of the yard. Henry turned slightly, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression unreadable. Then, wordlessly, he stepped back and sat on an old tree stump, letting the silence wrap around them both. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Rusty looked out at the field. It had no walls, no fences, no traps, no shouting voices. It was just space, open and empty and full of possibility. His ears twitched. A breeze stirred the grass. The world felt too big for a heartbeat. And then his paws moved, not in panic, not in fear, but forward. He trotted first, testing the ground, his body cautious but unrestrained. His legs remembered before his mind caught up. how to stretch, how to leap, how to move without waiting for permission. The cold air rushed past him, waking something long buried. Then he ran, full stride, tail lifted, ears back, muscles moving with a rhythm he thought he'd forgotten. His paws pounded the earth, kicking up bits of frost and mud as he looped wide circles around the field. Not escaping, not fleeing, flying. Louise stepped onto the porch and gasped, her hand rising to her mouth. Scout barked from behind her legs, dancing excitedly. Henry just watched, unmoving, a soft smile growing beneath his weathered expression. Rusty ran until his breath came heavy, his tongue lolling out, steam rising from his body in the chill. And when he finally slowed, he turned back, not toward the woods, not toward the edge of the property, but straight toward Henry. He didn't hesitate. He jogged the last few steps, then pressed his head gently into Henry's knee, chest heaving, eyes half closed. Henry reached down, fingers threading through the coarse fur behind his ears. No words, just contact. Rusty didn't pull away. When they returned to the house, Rusty didn't go straight to the door. He paused, glanced over his shoulder at the field, then looked back up at Henry. He had been free, and he had come back. That night, he lay not near the door, but by the hearth. Scout nestled beside him, curling into the crook of his belly like a living heartbeat. Louise sat on the couch, knitting slowly, her rhythm calm. Henry read, glasses perched low on his nose. The house was still, but not empty. Rusty sighed once, long and low, and closed his eyes. Trust, it seemed, didn't come with leashes or fences. It couldn't be forced. It had to be offered, then chosen. And that day, in a wide, open field where no one asked him to do anything at all, Rusty made his choice. Winter settled slowly over the hills, draping the landscape in stillness. Frost traced the edges of every window pane, and the trees stood bare against the grey sky, their limbs thin and reaching. Inside the little cottage, the fireplace crackled softly, its warmth curling into every corner of the home. Rusty lay on the rug near the hearth, his body stretched out, breath slow and even. Scout was curled beside him, their rhythms now matched like a steady song. There was no more pacing at night, no more watching the door. Rusty no longer kept one eye open in sleep. He had stopped waiting. He had arrived. Louise moved gently through the room, a blanket over her shoulders, a cup of tea in hand. She paused by the fire, letting her eyes rest on the two dogs. A smile touched her lips, quiet, grateful. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Henry sat in his worn armchair, a book resting open on his lap. But he wasn't reading. He was watching Rusty, his fingers moving absently, as if still trying to believe that this peace was real. The house no longer echoed. It breathed. There were routines now. Mornings with walks down the frost-kissed trail, evenings spent watching the light fade behind the trees, days filled with quiet presence, no demands, no expectations, just the steady building of a life. And Rusty had become part of it. He no longer feared the leash. He no longer flinched at raised voices or sudden sounds. He came when called. He leaned into hands when they reached for him. He even wagged his tail, slowly, deliberately, when Henry stepped through the door at day's end. He was not the same dog who had once cowered in the corner of Kennel 12. He had learned something better than survival. He had learned to trust. And as the firelight flickered across his fur and the world outside fell into quiet snow, Rusty shifted closer to Scout, resting his head gently on the pup's back. He was not waiting anymore. He was home.